We're deep in the middle of manslaughter, trying to determine when extenuating circumstances might mitigate an intentional killing from murder too. We reviewed the doctrine of heat of passion, which acknowledges that ordinary people might become so inflamed with passion that they could be moved to kill because of that intense emotion. This defense focuses on, at least to some extent, what the victim did to push the defendant to kill. In that sense, it's a little bit of victim blaming. Remember the psychiatrists in both Gerard and Barry smearing the victim, painting a picture of why the defendant was pushed to kill? Implicit in their message were, if you were married to Joyce or Rachel, you would have been moved to kill them also. I gotta confess, this tactic bothers me. That this kind of tactic has to be employed to get across how bad the victim was so you can see why the defendant was moved to kill. That's why the heat of passion doctrine is often referred to as a partial justification defense. Defendant is saying, I was partially justified in killing the victim because of the victim's own actions. Enter the model penal code. We've talked about the model penal code in other settings, and this is one of those settings where you'll have to know it as well. As a reminder, the model penal code was developed by a group of academics, judges, and lawyers, and often adopted by the states. It represents what this group, the American Law Institute, believes is the ideal penal code to follow. Well, it appears that the American Law Institute wasn't very happy with the way the heat of passion doctrine sets up this false dichotomy that reasonable people kill when they're enraged, because they don't. Or the way the heat of passion doctrine necessarily blames victims for having pushed defendants to kill them, which they don't believe it does. Instead, it decided to start from scratch to develop the law of voluntary manslaughter under extenuating circumstances. It wanted to draft a completely different way of viewing this affirmative defense. It felt strongly that there should be a defense, but it felt strongly that the modern view of voluntary manslaughter didn't correct the problems inherent in the doctrine. The model penal code didn't want to engage in this philosophical fantasy that reasonable or even average people kill because of provocation. Nor did it want to focus on what the victim did wrong. In fact, maybe the victim did nothing wrong and still was killed. It wanted to focus on the defendant, period. So, the ALI, the American Law Institute, created a model penal code on voluntary manslaughter that had a very different way of looking at this kind of crime. Gone are the 5 elements for heat of passion. I'm going to repeat that. Gone are the 5 elements we've discussed. Wipe them out like you're erasing remnants of a rule on a whiteboard. In its place is the doctrine of extreme emotional disturbance. It's got a section in the model penal code. The section is 210.3b. Don't have to know the number, but that's where it lies. It states, criminal homicide constitutes manslaughter when a homicide which would otherwise be murder is committed under the influence of extreme mental or emotional disturbance for which there is a reasonable explanation or excuse. The reasonableness of such explanation or excuse shall be determined from the viewpoint of a person in the actor's situation under the circumstances as he believes them to be. That's the rule, and it feels like a mouthful. Let's break them out into elements. First, the model penal code asks whether the defendant is operating under the influence of an extreme mental or emotional disturbance. I want to stop it there. That's the first threshold question. Can you see whether the defendant is, in fact, operating under an extreme mental or emotional disturbance? Then it asks for which there is a reasonable explanation or excuse. That phrase, for which, modifies the disturbance. In other words, we're asking, is there a reasonable explanation or excuse for why the defendant was so disturbed? You see a friend deeply upset. You say, what's going on? Why are you so upset? And the friend gives you the reason. You nod your head and you say, oh my God, I get it. I get why you're so upset. Your dog died, or you lost your job, or your spouse left you. But now let's suppose a friend says, so upset, it took me 20 minutes last night in line at Walmart. And you say to yourself, really? Really, this is why you're so upset? That's what we're looking for. The definition is asking whether there's a reasonable explanation or excuse for the disturbance. Notice that this definition does not ask the following. It never asks, is there a reasonable explanation or excuse for the killing? Because the model penal code believes there can never be an explanation for killing because of provocation. It asks a very different question. The Model Penal Code doesn't want to ask that question because it thinks it's a foolish question. Instead, it only wants to ask if there's a reasonable explanation for the emotional state in which defendant finds himself. So look at that emotional state. Some people, when facing emotional tragedy, they might eat a lot. They might drink a lot. They may lie in bed and pull the covers over their head. They may exercise a lot. A few might even kill. How one actually responds to the trauma isn't relevant. The Model Penal Code doesn't care. They only care the defendant was in such an emotional state and there's a reasonable explanation for it. I hope you can see that this is such a departure from the heat of passion doctrine, which basically asks whether the provocation was so bad that it moved defendant to kill. Under extreme emotional disturbance, or what I affectionately call EED, nobody asks that question. It only asks whether the disturbance had a reasonable explanation or excuse. So we have no victim blaming, no requirement to prove causal connection between the provocation and who the defendant killed. There aren't even time frames of the suddenness of the killing or cooling off time. It's really a simple test that shines the spotlight on the defendant to see if his emotional state is something that's relatable to us. Now remember, state has only one way of viewing this. Tests aren't determined by which defendant shows up in court. Either state is going to follow heat of passion, meaning traditional view or modern view, or it rejects the heat of passion doctrine and has adopted the Model Penal Code's view on extreme emotional disturbance. It never employs mixed tests in a single jurisdiction. And it's not even close in terms of the number of jurisdictions. The overwhelming majority of courts have adopted the Model Penal Code test of EED for this kind of manslaughter. So how does the Model Penal Code view of extreme emotional disturbance generally work? Let's take our example from a couple of lectures back. Defendant learned that Carl, the camp counselor, had molested his child. We went through that example under heat of passion, and we would have found that even under the traditional test or the modern test, defendant gets a voluntary manslaughter instruction and probably gets the defense of voluntary manslaughter. Now let's apply extreme emotional disturbance to this situation. First, we're going to ask whether the defendant was operating under an extreme mental or emotional disturbance. You might recall the facts. They said the defendant was seething with anger, couldn't sleep or eat. These facts show the manifestation of that extreme emotional disturbance. Okay, so far so good. We've met element number one. Now we need to ask the second question. Is there a reasonable explanation for why he's so disturbed? The Model Penal Code gives us a little bit of instruction on this phrase, reasonable explanation or excuse. But oh boy, the statement in this code section is complex and vague all at the same time. Hard to believe that's true. Here's what it says. It says that the reasonableness of the explanation shall be determined from the viewpoint of a person in the actor's situation under the circumstances as he believes them to be. It's kind of an objective test because a third person is judging the situation, so that makes it objective. But that person is doing so by dropping into the defendant's body, looking out his eyeballs, and reflecting on the external circumstances he sees. So it sort of combines a subjective test and an objective test into one. In this example, if a third person will look at the situation from a defendant's viewpoint, it would be completely reasonable why defendant was so disturbed. Plop into the body, look out, and you know that your child's been molested and traumatized by this person. It's a universal emotion everyone can understand. That's the end of the discussion. The Model Penal Code doesn't take it further. It doesn't ask about adequate provocation to kill. It doesn't ask about no time to cool off. It doesn't ask any of these questions because it's not relevant under this test. You might think, wow, this is a pretty easy test. It's a broad test. It sounds like everyone would get this defense. You might say, show me a defendant who's so disturbed, and as long as I look at it from his perspective, he receives the defense. I would caution us not so fast. Not so fast to assume that everyone gets this defense. The disturbance must still be rooted in a reasonable explanation. So let me haul out our beleaguered Guthrie. He's so upset by Farley snapping a dish towel at him. Does he get the defense of voluntary manslaughter under extreme emotional disturbance? Okay, let's take the elements. We can see that he's fuming. He's becoming so enraged, so emotionally disturbed. His own words and what was happening to him that night, we can see element number one. We're going to give him that. We're going to agree that he was acting under the influence of an extreme mental or emotional disturbance. But now comes the second requirement. Is there a reasonable explanation or excuse for why he was so disturbed? The Model Penal Code section judges that reasonableness from the viewpoint of an actor in Guthrie's situation. Okay? I'm popping myself into Guthrie's body. There I am in the restaurant, looking out his eyeballs, and I check out the circumstances. Here's what I see. I see a few snaps of the towel. Yeah, it hurts. Yeah, there might have been even some underlying taunting going on that precipitated that. But sorry, Guthrie, your disturbance is just not reasonable. There's no reasonable explanation or excuse for it. Guthrie wouldn't get the defense even though it's been broadened, even though it's been changed.